Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. Secretary General António Guterres of the UN said that first and foremost, Ukraine needs support towards ending the war and to help millions that have fled to return home. Many developing countries were already struggling to recover from economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Record inflation rising with interest rates, unmanageable debt burdens. They face skyrocketing food, energy, and fertilizer bills. With donor fatigue setting in across the developed world countries, we must come together, rich and poor, to find global solutions because this is a global crisis. No country will be able to insulate itself from meltdown of global economic systems, from the domino effect of hoarding food or fuel, or from long-term impact of increased poverty, hunger, he said. Resources are plentiful, but inequities, distribution, and logistic logjams mean supply chains have been disrupted, and better coordinated actions is essential. As we know, Ukraine is still under attack by Russia, and that for the foreseeable future there may not be an ending to this. And in the next segments we're going to hear from the Secretary of Defense he's on board the Air Force One doing a press conference, and we're going to hear from Justin Trudeau as he met with the President of the European Union, and they have a joint statement together that we need back to the idea of unity and bringing all of our countries together so that we can support Ukraine. And Ukraine isn't the only country that needs support from us economically with medical help and aid. There are other countries that are, of course, like Syria, that still need ongoing support. So, coming from the European Commission President and Justin Trudeau, Ursula von der Leyen, we strongly condemn President Putin's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and stand in wavering in our support of Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, territorial integrity. We are determined to defend our shared values and the rules based on international systems. We are committed to the advancement of human rights, gender equality, and inclusion, and the protection of fundamental freedoms. We call on Russia to stop its attack on Ukraine immediately, unconditionally withdraw its forces and all military equipment from Ukraine, and call on Belarus to stop facilitating and supporting Russia's invasion. They talk about the humanitarian support that is needed. We stand by the brave and resilient Ukraine people as they defend their homeland against Russian aggression, and as they suffer from Russian military indiscriminate and illegal attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure. We abhor Russia's grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, and will support all war crime investigations in this regard. We urge Russia to ensure unhindered humanitarian access and permit safe passage for civilians. We will continue to cooperate closely in delivering our humanitarian assistance within and outside Ukraine, and support of coordinated international response. The European Commission welcomes Canada's exploration of avenues to work with the European Emergency Response Coordination Center and the Civil Protection Mechanism hubs in Poland, Romania, Slovakia to help channel assistance to Ukraine. So we're going to hear that segment recorded in this next show, and we all need to stand together for human rights and for equality, and ensure that everybody is treated equally, the same, and with respect.
I have a National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, here, and he's going to say a few words, take a couple of questions, and then I'll take over after that and take any other questions you might have. Go ahead, Jake.
Hey guys, so we're heading into a full day tomorrow in Brussels. The president will start by meeting with the Secretary General to check signals, get on the same page in terms of the agenda for the NATO summit, and then he'll be at the NATO summit for 3 hours with his 29 fellow allied leaders. So it'll be NATO at 30. NATO itself has not, as an institution, been involved in the coordination or facilitation of security assistance to Ukraine. It's been individual members, individual allies who have done that. The United States obviously providing a really significant amount of military equipment and weapons to Ukraine, and also coordinating the supplies of allies as well to facilitate their delivery. So it will be a subject of discussion at the summit, even though institutionally NATO is not engaged in it. How we make sure that we're continuing to support Ukraine in its effort to defend itself, will be a topic of conversation among the leaders while the president is in Brussels. They will also discuss the question of NATO's force posture on the eastern flank. Leaders will ratify some of the decisions taken by defense ministers last week. We'll have more to say on that tomorrow. But they'll also task the military and political instruments of NATO to set out a longer-term game plan for what forces and capabilities are going to be required in those eastern flank countries to be ultimately agreed at the Madrid summit this summer, so that we've got a long-term footprint that is matched to the new security reality that's been created both by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and by what's happening in Belarus, including the fact that we're seeing Russian forces and projecting Russian forces ending up in a posture where there's more of them more frequently on the territory of Belarus, and perhaps other capabilities as well. So that'll be the NATO summit piece of it. The president will then have the opportunity to meet with the G7 leaders, and they'll issue a statement, and it will cover a range of issues. The G7 has been a central locus for sanctions coordination. It's where many of the key elements of the sanctions architecture were agreed and have been the details have been worked through. And the G7 leaders tomorrow will agree on an initiative to coordinate on sanctions enforcement, so that Russian efforts to evade the sanctions or other countries' effort to help Russia evade the sanctions can be dealt with effectively and in a coordinated fashion. And there'll be, a specific example of what that means discussed at the meeting and rolled out tomorrow. In addition, we, the United States, will announce a package of sanctions designations tomorrow that relate both to political figures, oligarchs, so individual designations, as well as entities, and that'll be released tomorrow. The G7 will also cover a number of other critical issues, including the global energy picture, the global food security picture, and some of the other knock-on and spillover effects of the conflict in Ukraine on the global economy and on the livelihoods of the citizens of our countries and people all around the world. And then the president will have the opportunity to have a signals check with President Michel, the president of the European Council, before he goes into a European Council meeting where he will have the opportunity to discuss the refugee and humanitarian situation that has been fast evolving over the course of the past month since Russia's latest military action got underway. He'll have the chance to talk about next steps on sanctions with the European Union. He'll have the chance to talk about democratic resilience and supporting civil society and journalists and other instruments of strong democracies in many of the partner countries of the European Union in the East. And there will be a few other elements to the discussion that he will have with European leaders, including China, and how we get coordinated on our approach vis-a-vis China, especially as it relates to China's involvement in the crisis in Ukraine, because the EU has a summit with China coming up on April 1st, so just a few days after the president will be engaging them in Brussels. The last thing is, throughout the day, the president will obviously consult on potential contingencies. The possibility of cyber attacks by Russia against the United States or other allied and partner countries, the possibility of the use of chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, the possibility of escalation in the conflict in other ways, and as I discussed yesterday at the podium, how to deal with the rhetoric and the commentary coming out of Russia on this whole question of the potential use of nuclear weapons. I said yesterday that we haven't seen anything that's made us adjust our posture, our nuclear posture, but it's of course something that we will have to continue to stay in close consultation with allies and partners on, as well as communicate directly to the Russians on. So let me stop there in terms of what tomorrow looks like, and happy to take your questions.
Can I ask on energy sanctions or energy actions? What you mentioned this yesterday. What is on the table in terms of some sort of deal or anything between the U.S. and the EU to try to reduce reliance on Russian energy? Of course, European partners have been more hesitant to enact the same measures that the UK, the US, Canada, and others have because they rely more heavily on it, in particular on natural gas. Is there anything you're going to discuss or announce on that? Is there a deal in place? What can you tell us?
This is a a substantial topic of conversation, a major priority for both the president and his European allies, is to reduce the dependence of Europe on Russian gas. Full stop. And the practical roadmap for how to do that, what steps have to be taken, what the United States can contribute, what Europe has to do itself, this has been the subject of intense back and forth over the course of the past few days and weeks. And we will have more to say on this subject specifically on Friday, particularly with the European Commission and the European Commission President von der Leyen. So he'll discuss it tomorrow. But in terms of further things to say publicly on the subject, I'm not going to preview it today, but you can zero in on Friday morning for more news on that, so stay tuned.
Can you say what the U.S. will tell its European partners, what it wants to see from China, or what it hopes Europe will seek from China? In other words, what is the latest in terms of what you perceive to be China's involvement or lack of involvement in Russia's war and the trajectory, I guess?
Well, as I said yesterday, we have not actually seen or do not have evidence of the actual provision of military equipment for use in Ukraine from China to Russia. But we are monitoring that closely, and of course our European allies are as well. And we've sent a clear message to China about the implications and consequences of any such provision of military equipment, and we're on the same page with our European allies on that, and we expect that they will convey similar messages in their dealings at the highest levels with the Chinese government. The same thing goes for systematic efforts to undermine, weaken, or circumvent the sanctions regime that we have put in place, and we've communicated on that as well to China, and we expect similar communication by the European Union and individual European countries, and we're also on the same page in that regard. And the G7 sanctions enforcement initiative, ensuring that there isn't systematic sanctions busting, that's not specifically about China, but it will apply to every significant economy and the decisions that any of those economies take to try in an intentional and active way to undermine or weaken the sanctions that we put in place.
Can I just follow up on the energy issue? The idea of reducing energy dependence sounds like a medium to long-term question. Is the United States, is the president going to be pressing his European allies to do more in the immediate term? A ban on oil, a ban on gas, ban on coal has been raised. I mean, and understanding that their reluctance because of their greater dependence is the message from the United States going to be, you guys need to act now?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that the United States itself is acting now to help Europe on the issue of dependence on Russian gas, diverting cargoes to help increase the supply of gas, U.S. LNG to Europe in the immediate term. And I think you can expect that the U.S. will look for ways to increase LNG supplies, surge LNG supplies to Europe, not just over the course of years, but over the course of months as well. Of course, that amount will grow over time. So our focus now is not on, over the course of the next couple of days, is not on a particular sanctions move we're asking Europe to make on this. It is rather, how do we put in place a strategy that is not just a long-term strategy, but is a short-term strategy to help reduce dependence and to create more freedom and flexibility then for different policy choices by the Europeans.
Can I put a finer point on the China question? They have a pre-existing economic relationship, China and Russia. Are your concerns about an incremental growth in that relationship as a financial relationship? Is status quo okay? Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about those concerns?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully...
China and Russia have a pre-existing financial relationship, trade. Is it okay if that trade continues as is? Or are you concerned about incremental change in that or growth in that kind of trade to avoid sanctions? Can you put a little finer point on that?
Sure. I mean, just three sort of examples that I think will give a little bit more flavor to the kinds of things we're looking out for. One is attempting to backfill in response to the export controls that we have imposed. Chinese companies or companies from other countries choose to backfill. We obviously have tools available to us to ensure that backfilling can't happen. That's one. Second is from the point of view of payment settlements and financial sanctions. Systematic efforts, industrial scale efforts to try to reorient the settlement of financial payments and so forth. That's something that in coordination with our G7 allies we will look at and respond to. And then third, of course, is the kinds of non-steady state, new efforts to try to seize opportunities that have been created by the reduction in commerce between Europe and Japan and other countries because of the sanctions. Not just with China, but across the board, that's something that we will look at as well. And, you know, I've been clear that we're not going to lay out in specifics the particular countermeasures we would take, the particular steps we'd impose. We're communicating that privately to countries. I don't want to use the microphone to threaten. I just want to say this is something we're vigilant about and that we have tools at our disposal to deal with in coordination with the G7 and with other countries.
Question on chemical and biological. Has the U.S. seen evidence that Russia has moved or deployed any of these weapons in a way to threaten Ukraine?
I don't have any intelligence to share with you today on this subject. The main thing that we're looking at right now is the deliberate drumbeat of misinformation, propaganda, and lies on this subject that has all the markers of a precursor to them actually using these weapons.
So is the U.S. assessment based entirely on that drumbeat of propaganda, or is it also based on movements of weapons?
It's a very fair question. All I can tell you right now is I can't comment further on the intelligence picture on this today, to the extent that I'm in a position to share further information related to our intelligence. I'll be sure to do so, but right now I don't have anything else to share.
Was there anything in your conversations with Chinese officials last week, or the president's conversations with President Xi, that left you at all reassured that the Chinese would not provide weapons or other assistance to the Russians, or are you more concerned after those conversations?
So I will beg your forgiveness in advance by being sort of intentionally vague in my answer to your question. And the reason is because this is not the kind of circumstance where you just kind of feel reassurance. It's going to require constant vigilance, constant monitoring. We will have to see what happens. So all I can really say to you is that coming out of that conversation, we have not seen the Chinese government move forward on the supply of weapons, but it's something we're watching every day, and I really can't characterize my level of comfort with that one way or the other. It's something we just have to maintain vigilance about.
Question on the EU. Do you want to see the European Union, does the administration want to see the European Union spend more on defense, such as what President Macron has suggested, that they should become, borrowing more money, spending more, bolstering its defense spending at this point?
President Biden and President Macron met in Rome in October. They put out a joint statement, and one of the points in that statement was support across the board for increased European capability and investment in the strength of their defense tools and the modernization of their defense establishments, with one very important principle underlying that, and that is complementarity with NATO. So all of this work that's being done by individual European countries, by the European Union, this is something that contributes overall to the health and strength of the transatlantic alliance, so long it is done in complementarity with NATO.
Should Russia still be part of the G20? Any concern, any talk about that? There's some countries that have voiced some opinions on that. I know there's a financial leadership meeting in Washington of the G20, come maybe April. Should Russia representatives attend that?
So what I said yesterday, which I'll repeat today, is that we don't believe it can be business as usual with Russian international institutions, but in terms of specific answers to that kind of question for the G20 or other international organizations, we want to have the opportunity to consult with our allies partners around the world, including our G20 partners, before I opine on that question publicly.
If you're looking at the sanctions and the upcoming planned sanctions that you plan to announce, on like a scale of 1 to 10, or do it on however measure you would like to, like, what do you have left? Like, where would you be at if 10 were ratcheted up to the highest degree?
What else could you do?
How much room to
So
grow do you have?
I would ask you guys, I guess, two questions, two things. The first is, in terms of an analysis of the macroeconomic impact of what we have done, and then, what additional tools are in the toolkit. Dilip, who's on the trip, and we'll get you with him in a backgrounder, so you have the opportunity to speak with him directly on this as the expert, and then to speak also with the Treasury Department. So that's one thing, because I think this is one where really getting down granularly into what hit has the Russian economy taken, in what way, and then, what are other things that we could do over time. But the second thing I would ask you is to consider this not just like we're firing bullets out of the chamber of a gun and we fired X number and there's Y number left. I think it's the wrong way to think about it. What we've done on the financial sanctions and the export controls is create a vise that is squeezing harder and harder with each passing day and week. And then as we see the impact and we see efforts to evade, we think about adjustments we need to make to ensure that vise continues to tighten. So our theory on this was never every 3 days we fire another bullet. It was put the major pieces in place, look for ways to continue to tighten the screws, and then consider other means as we go forward, and of course we will do that. So I can't characterize this question of what we've done and what we have left precisely, in part because we don't think of it quite in the terms that your question posed. But on the kind of macro picture, which is a kind of the way to back into an answer to your question, I'd ask you to speak with Dilip.
Can you talk a little bit about Friday? There's obviously a big gaping hole in the president's schedule. Is he going to go close to the border? Is he going to meet with? Is he going to tour refugees with refugees? What else can you tell us about Friday?
I'll let Karine talk to you about Friday when the time is right.
JCPOA update, and to what extent that will be discussed on this trip during this week.
So he'll have the chance to talk to our E3 European partners, UK, France, Germany, who are members of the P5+1, as well as the European Union, which plays this important coordinating role in the P5+1. Things stand now is we've made progress over the course of the past several weeks. There's still some issues left. We're working on those issues. It's unclear whether this will come to closure or not. But we're diligently trying to drive the diplomacy to a place where we have put Iran's nuclear program back in a box.
So a deal could put more money or more freedom to use money in the hands of Iran, and that in turn could be a lifeline to Russia's economy. Can you talk about the sort of triangulation of that here?
First, Russia posed both publicly and privately this proposition that Iran should somehow be entirely carved out of the sanctions regime, which was not accepted by any of the parties. So the only real question of sanctions as it relates to Russia in the context of the JCPOA is about sanctions on Iran being able to, for example, cooperate with the Russian atomic energy authorities to ship out their enriched uranium. So we feel confident that if we were to get back into the JCPOA on a compliance for compliance basis, it would not create a significant economic opportunity for Russia, and we would take whatever necessary enforcement steps to ensure that that was the case.
Jake, how much visibility do you have into the status of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations right now, and how much faith do you have in the Russians being a trustworthy negotiation partner in the first place?
Well, I will point out that Russia has not been trustworthy in its public statements about its intentions with respect to Ukraine for months. So we take everything that they say at the negotiating table or from their podiums with a very large grain of salt. We are in very consistent communication with our Ukrainian friends, and President Biden speaks to President Zelensky on this issue. President Biden also speaks with presidents of France and Germany, the Prime Minister of Israel, President of Turkey, others who have been actively engaged in discussions with President Putin and President Zelensky. So we're actively engaged in monitoring the ongoing diplomacy, though the United States is not directly at the table or directly playing any kind of mediating or brokering role. And we will see how things unfold. Our basic principle is this is about Ukraine's future, Ukraine's destiny, and therefore it is up to Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian people to make their own judgments about any agreement that they would reach with the Russians.
On the transfer of air defense systems to Ukraine, is that moving forward? We're talking about the S-300 systems, things like that. There's a large shuffle going on. What's the latest on that? When could Ukraine expect to see those systems in their country?
Good about the progress that we are making with respect to air defense systems. And I'm not going to get into further details on that because I don't want to compromise the ongoing effort to ensure that Ukraine gets the tools it needs to protect itself from the sky.
Can you confirm that NATO allied countries want to extend the contract of the Secretary General Stoltenberg and what the president's view, possibly through September of 2023, and what the president's view on that might be?
The president thinks very highly of Secretary General Stoltenberg. They've developed a relationship of trust, and Secretary General Stoltenberg has played an instrumental role in helping secure the powerful unity you've seen at NATO through this crisis. And I don't have anything for you on the question of his tenure.
Continuity there and not sort of breaking this up in the middle of this conflict.
So all I will say is we think that Jens Stoltenberg has been doing a fantastic job and day in, day out has played a critical leadership role for NATO. And you'll forgive me if for today on this plane flight I will add nothing to that other than our unreserved view that Stoltenberg is a real asset to the alliance. And then, the leaders will have the chance to talk tomorrow.
Does the president plan to send additional U.S. troops to Eastern Europe? And if so, how many?
So we don't have any plans for announcements of specific additional units to move to Eastern Europe at this time, but the president is constantly reviewing plans for near-term adjustments to our force posture in all the Eastern flank countries, depending on how things develop. So that's not a today thing or a tomorrow thing, but it's a matter of consistent reassessment.
Do you expect additional troop deployments to be announced on this trip?
And that's part, but the broader, the long-term question of NATO force deployment along the eastern,
Yes,
that could involve U.S. troops.
Two aspects of this will be discussed tomorrow. One is the immediate need to shore up on a rotational basis those allies on the southern end of the eastern flank, and that will be discussed tomorrow. And then the second is across the entire eastern flank, as we head to the Madrid summit, what decisions does NATO have to take for longer-term force posture adjustments? And of course, some of those will involve U.S. forces.
On this trip, what are you looking to hear from other EU and UK leaders? You talked about trying to reduce Europe's energy dependence on Russian oil and gas. What else would you like to hear from the leaders that the president will be meeting?
I think what we would like to hear is that the resolve and unity that we've seen for the past month will endure for as long as it takes. That's at a top line. Then how that translates specifically, that countries follow through on the commitments they've made with respect to the supply of military equipment and add to those commitments as Ukraine's needs evolve over time. That countries remain fully committed to enforcing the sanctions on the books, and to the extent we find additional targets that can help impose pressure on Putin, we move in a joint way on that. That we all work together to do our part on the humanitarian element of this crisis, but both the suffering inside Ukraine and the refugee crisis outside Ukraine. Here, Europe has really stepped up in a huge way, and it's the United States that will be coming with additional commitments on both humanitarian assistance and refugees tomorrow. And that NATO as an alliance puts its money where its mouth is when it comes to actually defending every inch of NATO territory, and that means following through on the necessary capabilities and contributions to defend the eastern flank and to defend the whole alliance. That's what tomorrow's all about across an integrated set of 3 meetings, and we think that we will have a substantial set of outcomes that will emerge by the end of the day when, after many hours, the president will emerge to address all of you.
Does President Biden plan to have a short bilat with Turkish President Erdogan on the sidelines of NATO?
We don't have a bilat scheduled with President Erdogan, but you know how these things go. They'll be hanging out at NATO headquarters, and I expect he'll have the chance to have brief conversations with a number of leaders.
Is the U.S. position on giving planes to Ukraine remains the same, or are you looking to discuss that if the Polish, for instance, bring it up? Is it still your belief that it should not be NATO giving planes to Ukraine?
There's been no change in our position on the MiG-20.
You guys formally shut down the idea of a peacekeeping force that the Poles have raised, or is that something that is still at least open for discussion from the U.S. perspective?
President Biden's been very clear that we're not sending U.S. soldiers to fight Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I have not myself had the opportunity, nor has President Biden had the opportunity to consult with his Polish counterpart or I with mine on exactly what they have in mind, so we'll have that conversation. But our position with respect to deployment of U.S. forces in Ukraine has been clear from the start, and it remains unchanged.
The difference between saying U.S. forces shouldn't be deployed and NATO forces should not be deployed into Ukraine. Do you have the same red line about forces under a NATO banner from other NATO countries going into Ukraine?
I mean, before I opine on what is a hypothetical or theoretical question like that, I think it's important for us to get the opportunity to hear more about something we've just seen in the press, and then we can speak to it. All right.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Now you get to tell us all about the refugees and the Friday schedule.
Okay.
Transition to clean energy is the key to phase out our dependency on fossil fuels more generally. We are both committed to speeding up the transition to net zero, and in this context, we will also pursue our partnership on raw materials, which is instrumental to achieving the transition to climate-neutral economies. Let me finish with one of the most urgent issues, and this is food security. We all know how important Ukraine and Russia are for the global food trade. Many countries in the European neighborhood and across the globe depend to a large extent on their exports from Ukraine, in particular of wheat. The World Food Programme, I think 50% of the wheat of the World Food Programmes is coming from Ukraine. Therefore, the Russian aggression to block Ukrainian exports through the Black Sea is seriously endangering global food security, and this is completely immoral. The European Union and Canada will work together to ensure the provision of direct food aid and to ramp up the supply of agricultural products more generally. So, dear Justin, we have a lot in common. We're friends and partners. We share the same values and the same goals, and through this work, the bond between us will be even stronger. Alors voilà, cher Justin, un agenda bien chargé pour notre discussion et pour notre coopération à venir. Les temps historiques que nous vivons l'exigent, et c'est aussi l'occasion de réaffirmer la force de notre amitié et des liens qui nous unissent. Sois le bienvenu ici au Berlaymont.
Merci Ursula, quel plaisir de te retrouver ici ce soir. Effectivement, on a beaucoup d'enjeux dont il va falloir qu'on discute, mais d'abord, je veux te dire un grand merci pour tout ton leadership. From the beginning of this challenge, and quite frankly, through the beginning of our times working together, Ursula has been an extraordinary partner, an extraordinary leader, and particularly when it came to bringing the European Union to a place where sanctions could be applied swiftly and with extraordinary strength. It was really your leadership that made this happen, and I got to see it up close as we were discussing in many, many small groups how we would have to remove if Russia did the unthinkable. And now that it has, the strength of your leadership and the commitment across the Atlantic to holding Vladimir Putin to account and making sure that he fails in this illegal, horrific war on innocence and on a democratic nation is extraordinarily important. This invasion, of course, is unacceptable. When I spoke with President Zelensky yesterday, we discussed increasing civilian casualties and repeated his call and my call to halt Russian attacks, withdraw forces, and stop committing war crimes. We vowed that Canada will continue to back Ukraine wholeheartedly, but as Ursula and the European Union has demonstrated, it is not something that any one of us has to do alone. We are doing it together and united in a way that is demonstrating not just that we stand for our friends and for a fellow democracy like Ukraine, but we also stand up for the values and the pillars that underpin all of our own democracies. This is an opportunity and a responsibility for all of us to continue to stand up for those fundamental rights and freedoms and stability and international rules that have underpinned the success of so many people, not just in Europe and across the Atlantic, but around the world over the past many decades. Putin's war has created a refugee crisis. And today, with President von der Leyen, we'll be talking about humanitarian support and, of course, what more we'll be doing to help. Canada, of course, will be there to welcome people fleeing war and tragedy, as we always are. But at the same time, we're going to be stepping up to provide help and work together to respond to the global food security crisis that is a real, meaningful consequence, direct consequence of Vladimir Putin's illegal war. We also will continue to urge Russia to allow for humanitarian corridors and safe passage for civilians and for those determined to help civilians. On va aussi parler des sanctions sans précédent imposées sur Poutine et les Russes. Il faut qu'ils comprennent, d'abord Poutine, mais aussi tous ceux qui l'entourent, à quel point il ne peut pas, il ne va pas profiter de cette guerre mal pensée. Au contraire, ça va être dévastateur pour l'économie russe et pour tous ceux qui ont appuyé Poutine. Of course, even as we're dealing with the terrible situation in Ukraine and the need to continue to stand up to defend our democracies, our rules-based order, we have lots of other things to talk about as well. And Ursula mentioned the importance of the green transition and energy cooperation. Canada is determined to continue to lead the way on moving towards net zero and decarbonizing as much as possible, at the same time as we recognize a need for people to replace Russian oil and gas in the short term. We will, of course, look at ways that Canada can help, but the real solution is to ensure that not only do we become less reliant on Russian oil and gas, we could become increasingly less reliant on oil and gas altogether as a world, and Canada will be there as a partner on that. We're also obviously going to continue our work on strengthening democracy and countering misinformation. Le travail pour rendre le monde plus sécuritaire doit aussi impliquer de partager les faits et la vérité avec les citoyens partout dans le monde. Les Russes sont maintenant en train d'être bouleversés par un niveau de propagande et de désinformation de Vladimir Poutine qui essaye de justifier cette guerre injustifiable. Alors nous allons continuer de travailler pour assurer que la vérité se sache partout dans le monde, mais aussi chez nous. On a du travail à faire tout en défendant toujours la liberté d'expression. Nous devons aussi assurer de contrer la désinformation toxique qui est en train d'affaiblir nos démocraties en même temps. State actors need to be held accountable for their actions in cyberspace, and Canada and EU will continue to make good progress on this. There's so many things we have to talk about. I'm looking forward to sitting down once again with President von der Leyen. We have lots to do, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation as always. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good
Merci.
to have you here.
Merci tout le monde.
Just to go on and move on to Ukraine. We now know that more than 200,000 people lack access to water across the Donetsk Oblast in the country's east. That's according to authorities and our humanitarian colleagues. More people could be cut off from water supplies as clashes continue in the area, potentially leaving millions of people without access to water. Attacks on healthcare are continuing. The World Health Organization said that since the 24th of February, there now have been 64 attacks on health facilities, healthcare workers, and ambulances. Health workers, healthcare facilities, and supplies must never be targeted. As we need to say that, it is sad that we need to say that over and over again. Any attacks on healthcare are violations of international humanitarian law. The International Organization for Migration is managing regional hotlines to help people move safely and have had more than 15,000 consultations in the last few weeks. They tell us that people are seeking information regarding human trafficking, as well as safe travels, how to seek asylum and obtain refugee status, and how to receive support from diplomatic institutions and other organizations. And a cash update for you, we're still at the 38% level of the $1.1 billion 2022 Ukrainian flash appeal. We thank the donors who've released their pledged money amounts and encourage others to convert pledges to cash as quickly as possible. And of course, the phone banks, as they say in telethons, remain open for people who have yet to pledge, and we would hope more pledges come through and more cash come through. And just now, the steering committee of the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance that the Secretary General announced earlier last week, is holding its first meeting. The aim of the steering committee is to coordinate the global response to the worldwide impacts of the crisis in Ukraine. In his remarks, the Secretary General is expected to note that many developing countries are already struggling to recover from the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now they face skyrocketing food, fuel, and fertilizer bills. The Secretary General will stress that we need to bring developed and developing countries together to find global solutions because this is a global crisis. The steering committee will be led by Amina Mohammed, our Deputy Secretary General, on behalf of the Secretary General, and will have 4 immediate areas of focus: coordination, action, data, and analysis, as well as partnerships. It will complement existing coordination and operational delivery mechanisms, lending its support to enhance and strengthen these arrangements and fill gaps as necessary. On food, for example, we will make a strong call on countries to prevent hoarding and speculative movements threatening supply and solidarity in time of crisis. All nations are urged to keep food markets open and to cease trade restrictions and export bans. The steering committee has about 31 members, including senior UN officials, representatives of Regional Development Bank, the International Chamber of Commerce, energy experts, and so on. And we'll release that list to you. The Security Council met this morning on cooperation with the League of Arab States. Addressing the Council, the Secretary General said the UN and the League of Arab States remain united in our pursuit of multilateral answers to the cascading challenges facing the Arab world and beyond. These efforts, he said, have added urgency as we face the profound global ramifications of the war in Ukraine. He noted that numerous countries, for example, import half of their wheat from Ukraine or Russia. That includes Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. The Secretary General discussed cooperation with the League in dealing with situations in Libya, Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Israel, and Palestine. The Council also heard from Ahmed Abu Ghait, the Secretary General of the League of Arab States. And I think that meeting is still underway. And on the heels of International Water Day, which was yesterday, Our humanitarian colleagues in the Horn of Africa tell us that millions of men, women, and children face severe water shortages, and are going hungry due to the devastating drought in the region. People in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia have endured 3 consecutive poor rainy seasons. If the rains are scarce from March to May, this drought risks becoming one of the worst climate-induced emergencies in the last 40 years in the Horn of Africa. Water resources have dried up across the region, forcing people to walk long distances to find water for their families and their livestock. The crisis also resulted in displacement, conflict over scarce water resources, the increased risk of violence and abuse against children and women. Food insecurity is at a record high. According to the latest estimate, between 13.1 and 14.1 million people in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia are struggling to put food on the table every day. The prolonged drought will leave more than 5.7 million children acutely malnourished in these countries in 2022, 1.7 million of them severely acutely malnourished. Humanitarian partners are scaling up the response and have helped 1.6 million people in Somalia, more than 2.7 million in Ethiopia, and more than 800,000 people in Kenya. Aid agencies are appealing for $4.4 billion to help some 30 million people in the 3 countries, but funding is extremely low. We urge donors and international community to step up their help to fight the drought in the Horn of Africa. And as you may recall, in November of 2020, we released the UN Research Roadmap for COVID-19 recovery in collaboration with 38 research funding agencies around the world, led by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Today, new data published in Welcome Open Research shows that between April of 2020 and July 2021, more than $800 million has been invested in nearly 4,000 research projects aligned with the UN roadmap. The roadmap for COVID-19 recovery provides a framework for leveraging the power of science in support of better socioeconomic recovery, more equitable and resilient and sustainable future. It identifies 25 research priorities and key scientific strategies to support a recovery that benefits everyone, as well as action that researchers, research agencies, government, civil society organizations, and UN entities can take. And today is World Meteorological Day. In his video message that we sent to you earlier this morning, the Secretary General announced that the UN will spearhead the new action to ensure every person on Earth is protected by early warning systems within 5 years. The Secretary General asked the WMO to lead this effort to represent an action plan at the next UN climate conference will take place at the end of this year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Today, 1/3 of the world's people, mainly in least developed countries or small island developing states, still are not covered by early warning systems. The Secretary General said this is unacceptable, particularly when climate impacts are getting worse. Early action and early warning save lives. Any more details on WMO's website and, of course, in the statement we issued. Basta. Yes, Majid.
Thank you, Stefan. On Ukraine, based on United Nations assessment, do you need a resolution from Security Council or General Assembly in order to deliver humanitarian aid? And do you think right now, what kind of decisions or attitude do you need from both bodies?
Well, we have been delivering humanitarian aid, right? We had a convoy go, I think, last Friday. We have humanitarian operations underway. I would just repeat what I said yesterday.
But you don't need it.
Well, we're delivering it, right? This is an organization made up of sovereign member states, legislative bodies, Security Council, General Assembly, Economic and Social Council. They will pass resolutions. It is their responsibility, their right, whatever you want to call it. We are not going to insert ourselves into which of the resolutions that's being discussed we want, right? This is the member states' prerogative, and not for the Secretary General to intervene. The only thing that truly helps us on this and every other issue is strong, united voices from the membership. Senor.
Steph, again on Afghanistan, what can the Secretary General do apart from statements, or what can the Security Council do? Any corps in the United Nations, and that this decision of the Taliban regime, can it affect to the fact that you are trying to be recognized by the United Nations as a member state? Thank you.
I mean, I will leave it to journalists and analysts to discuss the international diplomatic repercussions of what's happened. Our focus is on helping the women and girls who showed up at school today and were not able to get in, crushing their dreams, right? Which will have an impact on the future of Afghanistan. No country can grow by excluding women and girls from education. I mean, the fact that we still have to say this in the 21st century, we are going to continue to engage with the de facto authorities, with the Taliban, to try to get this decision reversed. But let's be clear, whether it's in Afghanistan or anywhere else, the UN is not the authority, right? Our responsibility is continue to do whatever we can to advocate, to work on the ground, to help people. But there are authorities in Afghanistan, and they are responsible.
But there are means of pressure.
Sorry?
There are means of pressure on the regime by the UN different.
Well, I mean, member states will you know, every different entities, whether it's the Secretary General or member states or bodies within this organization, have different levers, right? We act on, in terms of the Secretariat and the agencies, we act on what we have in our toolbox. And, you know, I mean, this came as a shock to a lot of people, and including, from what Sam said, the Minister of Education. So our head of mission there, Deborah Lyons, is written to the Taliban leadership. We'll be meeting with them tomorrow to try to get some understanding and to try to, obviously, to get a reversal. I'll come back to you. Stefano. Yeah, Stefano Graffiti.
Yes, follow up on this. I think the Secretary General, the UN in general, has more tools and have words, and words have a moral statement. Once, you know, they told Stalin that the Pope had said something, and Stalin answered how many divisions, what army the Pope has. Well, he didn't realize that the Pope, when he speaks, can have a certain weight with words. So what is the Secretary General, what words is going to use against the Taliban? You just read.
Stefano, I just read out the Secretary General's words. You just heard from Sam. You just heard from me. I mean, these are the words that we are using. We are not only using words, as I said, we are engaging. We will engage with the Taliban authorities to try to get some clarification about why this surprise decision was taken, to try to get some reversal of this. And when you talk about the UN, Stefano, what UN are you talking about? There are different parts of the UN. There's the Secretary General, there's the Security Council, there's the General Assembly. There are all sorts of entities in the UN. I think everyone is mobilized to support the inherent right of women and girls to get education, to get the same education that boys may be afforded. And everyone will work towards that same goal. I have no doubt. Everyone has different tools, and everyone may go at it different ways. But I think we all have to be united in this very goal.
Very, very quick follow-up. Do you think it's correct to say that the Secretary General of the United Nations, wherever it is, represent the moral conscience of the world when it speaks?
Do you have any issue with the words the Secretary General just used? Do you think they were weak?
I think they can be stronger. and can be, yes, because like you just say, sometimes when you answer, I understand that you interpreted his thinking, you say, you know, this is an organization, member states, they decide, we can only, it looks like that you want to give us the impression that the Secretary General can just arrive to a point. We think they can be more assertive.
I mean, listen, I'm going to read them again in case you weren't listening. Okay? The Secretary General says that denial of education not only violates the equal rights of women and girls to education, it also jeopardizes the country's future in the views of tremendous contributions made by Afghan women and girls. He urges the Taliban de facto authorities to open schools for all students without any further delay. Those are his words, right? Those are his words. And those words will be conveyed directly also to the Taliban authorities tomorrow by Deborah Lyons.
I'm not questioning the Secretary General
You can question whatever you want.
But let me be more blunt in my question. What kind of credibility is expected from Taliban? Since day one that they came back to power, and they had the women and girls at their crosshair. They say, oh, we're going to apply Sharia.
Fethi, do I look at Taliban spokesman?
No, I don't.
No, I mean, you're asking me questions.
But I mean the process.
You're engaged in like in a coffee chat conversation.
No, I'm not.
I will let you. That's an analysis question. You answer that question. I can only answer the question to what we are doing, to what we are saying. What impact it will have beyond the immediate heartbreaking impact on women and girls who are trying to get into school today, I will leave that to you. I'm going to move on for a second.
I'm sorry.
Fethi, I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Linda, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. My question involves the crisis, particularly in poor countries, regarding food. And the Secretary General, as you said earlier, is very concerned about and is trying to work on that situation. I was just wondering if you know if the Secretary General thinks that perhaps food from Russia, which is obviously under sanctions, should be allowed to be sold to these poor countries to help alleviate, particularly the ones that already buy it from Russia.
I don't know the details where the food from Russia is actually under sanction. What I do know is that the ongoing fighting, the ongoing access issues in the Sea of Azov, in the Black Sea, are making it very difficult, if not impossible, for grains from the breadbasket of the world, from Ukraine and from Russia, to get out through that way. And for Ukraine, the percentage I saw were extremely high of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea being used as air export routes for grain. The problem is that this conflict, beyond the horrors it is raining down on the people in Ukraine, it is having a potentially devastating impact on others, not only in terms of access to food, but also in terms of political stability. And this is exactly the crux of the issue the Secretary General and the Steering Group are discussing today, to try to ensure that member states, to give advice to member states to ensure that they do not put in place policies that will make the matters worse, like hoarding, like closing off of exports, right? We kind of saw it with COVID, where this shutting down, this hoarding of medical supplies, it made things worse, right? There remains a lot of food on the open market, and we need to make sure that people who need it can access it. Yes, Dulcie.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to that convoy in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It went into Sumy. Mm-hmm. Was it successful, or is it still happening? Or
no, it was
just one day.
Yeah, it went in and out. And we put out a press release on Friday. But we're working on more. There are no other UN convoys. There were no today, and we'll see what the next days bring.
So possibly one into Mariupol, or
let me put it this way: we know where the needs are. We're trying to get to where it's needed. Obviously, the biggest aspect is the continuing fighting.
And just one other question on that. So this deconfliction program. is the UN? It's the UNDP. I think you said that's working with. No.
So it's our humanitarian colleagues.
Okay.
And our colleagues in the Department of Safety and Security.
Okay, and so are they still working with the Russian defense minister on this?
They're in contact with the Ministry of Defense in Russia. They're in contact with the appropriate authorities in Ukraine. Again, this is these efforts are not a political effort. It's about ensuring the safety of the delivery of humanitarian goods and personnel. We have similar systems in Geneva, which works on the Syria context, and we have a similar setup in dealing with the Yemen context.
So Russia has been cooperative on this particular issue of delivering humanitarian aid in a specific time and place.
Let me put it this way. They have been cooperative in the sense that they have invited, and we have UN personnel in Moscow who work with the Ministry of Defense. Like all of these deconfliction, it is not about guarantees. It's about ensuring that all the warring parties know where we want to go and creating a situation where we feel it's safe that we can go there. Majid.
Thank you, Stefan. On the talks about JCPOA, the Iran nuclear program, yesterday the State Department Press Secretary Ned Price said an agreement of this sort is neither imminent nor is it certain. Any reaction?
We're watching what's going on with the JCPOA. We're not a party to it. We have been saying for quite some time, since this was signed and after it was partly undone, that we believe this is a very important agreement, and we hope the parties will come to some agreement on it. Okay. Thank you. Now we'll leave it to Okay, I'm going to go to Gregory, and then Maggie, if that's you, I'll come back to you in a second.
It's Chris with CBC. Actually.
Oh, Chris, sorry. Chris, stand by 2 seconds. I'm going to go to Gregory, and then I'll come to you.
Stefan, thank you very much. Russian ambassador to Poland said that authorities of Poland has blocked the bank accounts of Russian embassy, et cetera. It's clear violation of Vienna Convention. How can you assess that?
Let me take a look. I mean, I don't know the particular case. As we've always said, we believe strongly in defending the Vienna Convention and the work of diplomats, but I have to look into that particular case. Chris, please.
Steph, just ahead of the NATO summit, there's some predictions that they might call for a NATO peacekeeping force into Ukraine, and others have said that perhaps a UN peacekeeping force would be a much safer option. I don't know if you've already spoken to this, but what's the Secretary General's reaction?
I think the Secretary General. Sure. I mean, the Secretary General spoke about this at the beginning of this crisis. What is clear is that the way for any peacekeeping mission to get created is for a Security Council mandate to get approved by the Security Council. And obviously, what is also very important for any UN peacekeeping mission is that there is a peace to keep.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.